This is HOA clapback. I did not raise my voice. I raised my evidence packet. Carol yelled that the tow vendor was owed money and I was the easiest target. You do not need to understand it. You need to comply. She jabbed her bright phone case at me like a badge, her pixie-cut gray hair catching the glare off the windshield behind her, sweat already beading on her forehead in the Milwaukee heat. I stood on the curb outside my driveway in Pinecrest Village Estates, wearing my navy polo and holding a folded printed page with highlights I had pulled from my glove box 30 seconds earlier. The tow truck idled 10 feet away, diesel smoke hanging in the hot air. The driver leaning against the cab with his clipboard and watching us like this was better than his radio. Carol turned to him and said, "The association has a contract. Hook it now." I looked at her and said, "Show me the notice." She smiled, pulled a laminated sheet from her jacket pocket and said, "This was posted 72 hours ago. You missed the window." I said, "I checked my mailbox yesterday. There was nothing." She said, "Not my problem," and waved the tow driver forward. I work as a home inspector in Milwaukee, so I notice every detail, and the timeline she just gave me did not line up. I said, "Stop," and held up the folded page. The driver paused, squinting at me. I said, "This is a certified mail receipt showing I was compliant 2 weeks ago. The association signed for it." Carol's smile tightened. She said, "That was a different issue. This is a new violation under gate access standards." I said, "What standards? You never sent me gate access standards." She said, "You do not build to my standard. You pay to my standard." And she turned back to the driver. He looked at me, then at her, then said, "Look, I need both of you to agree or I am leaving." Carol snapped, "The HOA owns the contract. Hook it." The driver sighed, walked to the truck, and started lowering the hook. My neighbor across the street, an older guy named Paul who works security at the mall, stepped onto his porch and called over, "What is going on?" Carol ignored him. I said to Paul, "She is saying I violated a rule I never received." Paul crossed his arms and stayed on his porch watching. Carol said to me, "If you have a problem, file an appeal, but the truck is taking your car now." I pulled my phone out and started recording. Carol's face went red. She said, "You cannot record me without permission." I said, "Wisconsin is a one-party state. I can." She stepped closer and said, "Go ahead and call whoever you want. I have a committee for that." I said, "What committee?" She said, "The compliance committee, and you are already on the list." I looked at the driver and said, "Have you seen the violation notice she is talking about?" He shrugged and said, "I just hook what they tell me to hook." I turned the phone to Carol and said, "So there is no notice?" She said, "There is a notice in the system, and that is enough." The driver looked uncomfortable. He said, "Ma'am, if he is saying he did not get it, I think I need something in writing." Carol pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and held it up to show him something. She said, "This is the portal log. It was uploaded 72 hours ago." I said, "Uploaded does not mean delivered." She said, "The system generates delivery confirmation automatically." I said, "Show me the confirmation." She lowered her phone and said, "I do not have to justify association records to you," and she waved the driver forward again. Paul walked down his driveway and stopped at the curb. He said, "Carol, he is asking for proof. Just show him the paper." Carol turned on him and said, "This is not your property, Paul. Stay out of it." Paul said, "I am standing on a public street." Carol's jaw tightened. She said, "The association has a process. If he wants to dispute it, he can file a written appeal within 10 business days. I said, 10 days after what? I still do not have a notice. She said, "After today," and she pointed at the truck. The driver said, "Okay, I am not getting in the middle of this," and he started raising the hook. Carol said, "You are under contract." The driver said, "Lady, I am under contract to tow cars with proper authorization, not to referee your argument," and he climbed back into the cab. Carol's face went from red to purple. She said, "I will have your company blacklisted." The driver said, "Good luck with that," and he drove off. Carol turned to me and said, "You just cost the association money, and I will make sure you pay for it." I said, "I did not cost you anything. You did not have the paperwork." She said, "I have the paperwork. It is in the clubhouse, and you can see it at the next compliance hearing." I said, "When is that?" She said, 2 weeks, maybe 3. I said, "You just said I had 10 days to appeal." She said, "The appeal window and the hearing schedule are separate." I said, "That makes no sense." She said, "It does not have to make sense to you. It is in the bylaws." Paul said, "Carol, are you serious right now?" Carol snapped, "Paul, if you keep interfering, I will file a complaint against you too." Paul laughed and said, "For what?" standing on the street. Carol did not answer. She turned and walked toward the clubhouse, her pink bucket hat bobbing with each step, and I stood there holding my phone and the folded page, my heart still racing from the confrontation. I walked back inside and sat at my kitchen table. The whole thing felt wrong. I have lived in Pinecrest Village for 3 years, and I know Carol Collins has been gate access administrator for at least 5. Her job is to manage access cards and log complaints, but somewhere along the way she turned it into a personal enforcement empire. She loves saying, "You do not build to my standard, you pay to my standard," and she has said it to half the neighborhood at some point. I pulled up my email and searched for anything from the HOA in the last 2 weeks. Nothing about gate access. Nothing about a new violation. I checked my physical mailbox again, flipping through junk mail and bills, and found nothing. Then I remembered something Paul had told me a year ago, when Carol tried to fine him for parking his work van in his own driveway. He said she backdated the notice so the appeal window closed before he even knew about it. He fought it at a meeting and lost because the board said the portal log was the official record. I never thought much about it at the time because it did not affect me, but now I was starting to wonder if this was the same playbook. I opened my laptop and logged into the Pinecrest Village portal. The site was slow and clunky, the kind of design that looked 10 years out of date even when it launched. I clicked through to the compliance section and saw my name on a list with a red flag next to it. I clicked the flag and it opened a PDF. The violation notice was dated 3 days ago, just like Carol said, but the creation timestamp in the file properties said it was generated this morning. I took a screenshot. Then I scrolled down and saw a second notice, dated 2 weeks ago, for a completely different issue. That one matched the certified mail receipt I had in my hand. I took another screenshot. I opened a blank document and started typing notes. Carol claimed the tow was for a gate access violation. The notice in the portal was created today, but backdated to 3 days ago. The earlier notice I actually received was for a different issue that I already resolved. She tried to use the tow as leverage even though the paperwork was fake. I saved the file and leaned back in my chair. This was not just moving goalposts. This was forgery. I called Paul. He picked up on the second ring and said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, but I need to ask you something. Did you keep any of the paperwork from when Carol tried to fine you last year?" He said, "I kept everything. Why?" I said, "Because I think she is doing the same thing to me." He was quiet for a second, then said, "You mean the backdating?" I said, "Exactly." He said, "Come over, I will show you what I have." I grabbed my phone. the printed page in my laptop, and walked across the street. Paul met me at the door and led me to his dining room, where he had a plastic file box on the table. He said, "I keep all my HOA stuff in here because I do not trust them." He opened the box and pulled out a thick envelope with a tracking label turned away. He said, "This is the notice I got, and this is the portal screenshot from the same day." He handed me both. The notice was dated 2 weeks before the portal upload. The screenshot showed the creation timestamp was the same day he received it. I said, "So she did not backdate yours?" He said, "Not that one, but look at this." He pulled out a second envelope. "This notice is from 3 months earlier, and it is for the same violation. Same wording, same format, same penalty amount." I compared the two. They were identical except for the dates. I said, "Did you ever resolve the first one?" He said, "I never got the first one, I only got the second one, and by the time I saw it, the appeal window was already half gone." I said, "Did you fight it?" He said, "I tried. I went to the meeting and showed them I never received the first notice, but Carol pulled up the portal log and said it was posted, and that is all that matters." The board voted to uphold the fine. I paid it because I did not want a lien on my house. I looked at the 2 envelopes again. I said, "Can I take pictures of these?" He said, "Take the whole thing, I have copies." He handed me the file box. I said, "Paul, I think there is a pattern here." He said, "I know there is, but no one on the board will listen because Carol runs the compliance committee and she controls the records." I said, "What if we could prove the records are wrong?" He said, "How?" I said, "I am working on it." He nodded and said, "Let me know if you need anything else," and I walked back to my house with the box under my arm. I spent the next 2 hours going through Paul's paperwork and cross-referencing it with my own. The patterns were obvious once I laid everything out. Carol used the same violation template for multiple people. She always backdated the notice so the cure window was already half gone when it arrived. She uploaded the notice to the portal on the day she handed it out, but she changed the PDF date to make it look older. I pulled up the portal again and started searching for other compliance cases. I found 6 more in the last year that followed the same pattern. All of them had notices with creation timestamps that did not match the posted dates. All of them were handled by Carol. I took screenshots of every single one. Then I opened a new document and started drafting a timeline. I listed every case, every date mismatch, every identical template. I included my own case at the top and Paul's case as a supporting example. By the time I finished, I had 12 pages of documentation. I printed it, hole-punched it, and put it in a 3-ring binder with divider tabs. On the cover I wrote, "Compliance Audit Request," and I underlined it twice. I let the meeting move on. Because my move was not a speech, it was a document. The next morning, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. I answered and a woman said, "This is Jennifer from the management company for Pinecrest Village. We received a complaint filed against you yesterday for interference with association business." I said, "Interference how?" She said, "The complaint states you prevented a contracted vendor from completing authorized work, and you recorded a board member without consent." I said Wisconsin is a one-party consent state, and the tow driver left because Carol did not have proper authorization. Jennifer sighed and said, "I am just reading what was submitted. You will have an opportunity to respond at the hearing." I said, "When is the hearing?" She said, "It is scheduled for 2 weeks from today." I said, "Carol told me the hearing was 2 or 3 weeks out. Now you are saying it is exactly 2 weeks." Jennifer said, "The schedule is set by the board." I said, "Can I see the complaint?" She said, "It will be available at the hearing." I said, "That is not good enough. I need to see it now so I can prepare a response." She said, I can email you a copy if you submit a records request. I said, fine. Where do I send it? She said you can submit it through the portal or mail it to the management office. I said, how long does that take? She said, up to 10 business days. I said, the hearing is in 2 weeks. She said, then I suggest you submit it today, and she hung up. I pulled up the portal and found the records request form. It was a PDF with fillable fields that kept glitching every time I tried to type in it. I gave up, printed it, filled it out by hand, scanned it, and uploaded it. Then I emailed Jennifer directly and attached the same form. I said, records request submitted. Please confirm receipt. She replied 2 hours later and said, received. Processing time is 7 to 10 business days. I replied, the hearing is in 14 days. I need the complaint before then. She did not respond. I called Paul and told him what happened. He said, they do this on purpose. They drag out the records request so you do not have time to prepare. I said, what do I do? He said, show up at the management office in person. They have to give you something if you are standing there. I said, where is the office? He said, it is in Brookfield, about 20 minutes west, and they close at 4. I looked at the clock. It was 2:30. I grabbed my binder, my phone, and my keys, and I drove to Brookfield. The management office was in a low-rise building next to a strip mall. I walked in and the receptionist, a young woman with a tired expression, looked up and said, can I help you? I said, I am here to pick up a records request I submitted this morning. She said, do you have a request number? I said, no, I just submitted it a few hours ago. She said, it takes 7 to 10 business days to process. I said, I know, but the hearing is in 2 weeks and I need the complaint filed against me. She said, I cannot give you anything that has not been processed. I said, can I speak to Jennifer? She said, Jennifer is not in the office today. I said, when will she be back? She said, Monday. I said, that is 4 days from now, and I only have 14 days total. She said, I understand, but I do not have access to the files. I said, who does? She said, the compliance coordinator. I said, can I speak to them? She said, they are only in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I said, today is Thursday. She said, they left at noon. I put my binder on the counter and said, look, I am not trying to make your day harder, but Carol Collins filed a false complaint against me and I need to see it so I can defend myself. Do you have any way to pull it up? She looked at me, then at the binder, then back at me. She said, let me check. She turned to her computer and clicked around for a minute. Then she said, I see the complaint in the system, but it is flagged as pending review. I said, what does that mean? She said, it means it has not been finalized yet. I said, how can they schedule a hearing for a complaint that is not finalized? She said, I do not know. I just process the requests. I said, can you at least tell me what the complaint says? She said, I am not supposed to read it out loud. I said, then print it and hand it to me. She said, I cannot print it until it is processed. I stared at her. She stared back. Finally, she said, look, I can see the summary, and it says you interfered with a tow vendor and recorded a board member without permission. That is all I can tell you. I said, can you see who filed it? She said, Carol Collins. I said, can you see when it was filed? She said, yesterday at 4:15. I said, can you see if there is any supporting documentation attached? She clicked a few more times and said, there is one attachment, but it is not loading. I said, can you try again? She said, I already did, it just says file not found. I said, so the complaint is incomplete. She said, "I guess so." I said, "Can you make a note of that in the system?" She said, "I am not authorized to add notes to compliance files." I said, "Who is?" She said, "The compliance coordinator." I said, "Who is only here on Tuesdays and Thursdays?" She said, "Correct." I picked up my binder and said, "Thanks for trying," and I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Paul again. I told him what happened. He said, "That is classic. They schedule the hearing before the complaint is even finished, so you do not have time to respond." I said, "What do I do?" He said, "You show up at the hearing with everything you have, and you make them answer for it in front of witnesses." I said, "I do not even know what the complaint says." He said, "It does not matter. You have proof that Carol is backdating notices and fabricating records. That is bigger than whatever she is accusing you of." I said, "How do I prove it at the hearing?" He said, "You bring the binder, you bring the screenshots, you bring me as a witness, and you make them explain why the timestamps do not match." I said, "Will they listen?" He said, "Probably not, but everyone else in the room will, and that is what matters." I said, "What do you mean everyone else?" He said, "HOA hearings are open to all homeowners, and people show up when they hear something interesting is happening. You just need to make sure people hear about it." I said, "How?" He said, "Start with the neighborhood group chat." I did not know there was a neighborhood group chat. Paul laughed and said, "You are not in it because Carol kicked you out." I said, "I was never in it." He said, "Exactly. She kicked you out before you even joined." I said, "Can she do that?" He said, "She is the admin. She can do whatever she wants." I said, "How do I get back in?" He said, "You do not, but I can post on your behalf." I said, "What should I say?" He said, "Just the facts. Keep it simple. Say you are being accused of interference. Say you are requesting the complaint in writing, and say you will be presenting evidence at the hearing. People will read between the lines." I said, "Okay, do it." He said, "Done." I hung up and sat there for a minute trying to process everything. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I did not recognize. It said, "This is Rachel from 2 blocks over. I saw Paul's post. Carol did the same thing to me last year. Do you want to talk?" I replied, "Yes," and she called me 5 minutes later. She said, "Carol filed a complaint against me for leaving my trash cans out too long. She backdated the notice and I did not even know about it until I got a fine in the mail. I fought it and lost because the board said the portal log was proof of delivery. I said, "Did you keep the paperwork?" She said, "I have everything." I said, "Can I see it?" She said, "I can drop it off tomorrow." I said, "Thank you," and she hung up. By the end of the day, I had 3 more calls from neighbors who had similar stories. Every single one of them had a backdated notice, a fabricated timeline, and a compliance hearing that went against them. Every single one of them paid the fine because they did not want a lien. I added their cases to my binder and updated the timeline. By the time I finished, I had 22 pages of documentation covering 9 separate cases spanning 2 years. The pattern was undeniable. Carol was systematically targeting homeowners, backdating notices to compress the appeal window, and using the portal log as fake proof of delivery. I printed a clean copy of the entire binder and put it in a sealed evidence sleeve with a label that said, "Compliance audit evidence, do not open." I set it on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. This was not just about me anymore. This was about every homeowner Carol had screwed over in the last 2 years. I needed to make sure the board saw it, and I needed to make sure they could not ignore it. The next morning, I got another call from Jennifer. She said, I have an update on your records request. I said, go ahead. She said, the compliance coordinator reviewed your request and determined that the complaint is exempt from disclosure until after the hearing. I said, on what grounds? She said, association privacy rules. I said, that is not a real rule. She said, it is in the bylaws. I said, show me where. She said, I can email you the relevant section. I said, do it now. She said, I will send it this afternoon. I said, Jennifer, I know you are just doing your job, but Carol is using the process to cover up fraud and you are helping her. She was quiet for a second, then said, I am not helping anyone. I am following the rules. I said, the rules are being manipulated. She said, if you believe that, you can file a formal complaint with the board. I said, I am trying to, but you will not give me the documents I need. She said, the documents will be available at the hearing. I said, that is too late. She said, that is the process, and she hung up. If you are tired of HOA stories where the bad guy wins, stick around, because this one does not end that way. I called Paul and told him what happened. He said, they are stalling. I said, I know. He said, you need to go over their heads. I said, to who? He said, the state. Wisconsin has a homeowner protection law that requires HOAs to provide records within a reasonable time frame. If they are blocking you, you can file a complaint with the Department of Safety and Professional Services. I said, how long does that take? He said weeks, maybe months. I said the hearing is in 12 days. He said, then you need to use what you have and force the board to respond in real time. I said, how? He said, bring the binder to the hearing, bring the witnesses, and demand that they address the evidence before they vote on the complaint. If they refuse, you file the state complaint the next day and you make sure everyone knows about it. I said, will that work? He said, it worked for a guy in Waukesha last year. His HOA tried to fine him for a shed, and he brought a surveyor to the hearing. The board backed down the second they realized he had real documentation. I said, okay, I will do it. He said, good, and make sure you invite people. The more witnesses you have, the harder it is for them to ignore you. I spent the next 3 days reaching out to every neighbor who had contacted me. I asked them if they would be willing to attend the hearing as witnesses. 7 of them said yes. I sent each of them a copy of the timeline and asked them to review their own cases before the meeting. Rachel, the woman from 2 blocks over, called me back and said, I have been thinking about this, and I want to say something at the hearing. I said, what do you want to say? She said, I want to tell the board that Carol lied to me about the timeline and that I paid a fine I should not have paid. I said, are you comfortable doing that in front of everyone? She said, I am comfortable doing it in front of Carol. I said, okay, you are on the list. She said, good, I will see you there. I hung up and added her name to a witness sheet I was keeping in the front of the binder. By the end of the week, I had 9 confirmed witnesses and 31 pages of documentation. I felt ready. Then I got a text from an unknown number. It said, check the portal. I opened my laptop and logged in. There was a new notice on my account. The heading said, amended complaint, hearing rescheduled. I clicked it. The hearing was moved up by 4 days. It was now scheduled for 2 days from now. The amended complaint added 2 new charges: harassment of association staff and misuse of association records. I stared at the screen. Then I called Paul and said, they just moved the hearing up and added 2 new charges. He said, of course they did. I said, what do I do? He said, you go anyway and you bring everything. I said, I do not even know what the new charges are based on. He said, "It does not matter. They are making it up as they go, and you are going to prove it." I said, "How am I supposed to prove harassment?" He said, "You are not. You are going to prove Carol is backdating notices and fabricating records, and once you do that, no one will care about the harassment charge." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "I am sure." I said, "Okay, I will see you at the hearing." The day before the hearing, I got a call from a man who said his name was Dale, and he was the regional supervisor for the management company. He said, "I am calling because I will be attending the hearing tomorrow, and I wanted to touch base with you beforehand." I said, "Why are you attending?" He said, "Jennifer flagged your case as high risk and requested that I review the file." I said, "High risk how?" He said, "Multiple parties, disputed records, potential fraud allegations." I said, "There is no potential, it is fraud." He said, "That is a strong word." I said, "I have 31 pages of documentation proving Carol Collins has been backdating violation notices for 2 years. He was quiet for a second, then said, "I would like to see that documentation." I said, "You will see it tomorrow." He said, "I would like to see it now." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because if what you are saying is true, we need to address it before the hearing, not during." I said, "Carol has been blocking my records requests for 2 weeks. He said, "I am not Carol." I said, "How do I know you are not going to take my documentation and bury it?" He said, "You do not. But I am the only person in this process who has the authority to override the board, and if you want a fair hearing, you need me on your side." I said, "Fine, I will email it to you, but I am bringing the original tomorrow." He said, "That is fair," and he gave me his email. I scanned every page of the binder and sent it as a single PDF. 2 hours later, Dale called me back. He said, "I reviewed the file." I said, "And?" He said, "This is bad." I said, "I know." He said, "I am going to recommend that the board table the hearing and open an internal audit." I said, "Will they listen?" He said, "They have to. I am the regional supervisor." I said, "Carol runs the compliance committee." He said, "Not after tomorrow, she does not." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means if your documentation is accurate, and I believe it is, Carol is going to be removed from her position pending the audit." I said, "What happens to the charges against me?" He said, "They will be dismissed." I said, "What about the fine?" He said, "If there is a fine, it will be refunded." I said, "What about everyone else Carol screwed over?" He said, "That is what the audit is for." I said, "When will it start?" He said, "As soon as the board votes to authorize it, which will be tomorrow if I have anything to say about it." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Do not thank me yet. Just bring the binder tomorrow and be ready to walk the board through it." I said, "I will," and I hung up. The hearing was scheduled for 7 in the evening at the clubhouse. I got there at 6:45 and the parking lot was already full. I walked in with my binder under one arm and my phone in the other. The main room was set up with a long table at the front for the board and rows of folding chairs facing it. At least 30 people were already seated. Paul was in the 3rd row and he waved me over. I sat next to him and said, "This is a lot of people." He said, "Word got out. Everyone wants to see what happens." I looked around and recognized at least half the faces. Rachel was sitting in the front row with her arms crossed. 3 other neighbors I had spoken to were scattered through the room. Carol was standing near the board table, talking to a man in a suit. She looked at me and her expression went cold. The man in the suit looked over and nodded. Paul said, "That is Dale." I said, "I know, we talked yesterday." Paul said, "Good, then you know he is on your side." I said, "I hope so." At 7, the board president, a thin woman named Linda, called the meeting to order. She said, "We are here tonight to address a compliance complaint filed by Carol Collins against a homeowner. Before we begin, I want to introduce Dale Keller, regional supervisor for the management company, who will be observing tonight." Dale nodded from the side of the room. Linda continued, "The complaint alleges interference with association business and misuse of association records. The homeowner has requested an opportunity to respond." She looked at me and said, "You have 10 minutes." I stood up and walked to the front. I set my binder on the table and opened it. I said, "Thank you for the opportunity to respond. Before I address the complaint, I need to present evidence of a pattern of misconduct by the compliance administrator." I turned to the first page and said, "This is a timeline of 9 separate cases over the last 2 years where Carol Collins backdated violation notices, compressed appeal windows, and used fabricated portal logs to justify fines. I have screenshots of creation timestamps that do not match the posted dates. I have testimony from 7 homeowners who were targeted using the same template. I have proof that Carol uploaded notices to the portal on the day she delivered them, but changed the PDF date to make them look older." I looked up at the board. Linda's expression was frozen. The other board members were staring at the binder. Carol was standing near the wall, her face red, her arms crossed. I said, "I am requesting that the board authorize an internal audit of all compliance cases handled by Carol Collins in the last 2 years, and I am requesting that the charges against me be dismissed pending the results of that audit." Linda said, "Can you provide the board with a copy of this documentation?" I said yes, and I handed her the sealed evidence sleeve. She opened it and started flipping through the pages. One of the other board members, a man named Tom, leaned over and read with her. Carol stepped forward and said, "This is a coordinated attack." I said, "No, this is evidence." Carol said, "You harassed my staff." I said, "I requested records that I am legally entitled to." Carol said, "You recorded me without permission." I said, "Wisconsin is a one-party consent state, and I was recording a tow driver who was on my property without authorization." Carol's voice got louder. She said, "You cost the association money." I said, "I did not cost the association anything. You filed a fraudulent tow request and the driver refused to proceed." Carol turned to the board and said, "He is lying." Tom looked up from the binder and said, "Carol, these timestamps are not matching. What is going on here?" Carol said, "The system generates those automatically." Tom said, "The system does not backdate PDFs automatically. Someone has to do that manually." Carol said, "I do not control the system." Tom said, "You are the compliance administrator. You are the only one who uploads notices." Carol's face went purple. She said, "This is ridiculous. I am following the process." Tom said, "The process does not include changing document dates." Linda closed the binder and looked at Dale. She said, "Dale, do you have an opinion on this?" Dale stood up and said, "I reviewed the documentation yesterday, and I believe the evidence is credible. I recommend the board table the complaint against the homeowner, authorize an internal audit of all compliance cases handled by Carol Collins, and suspend Carol from compliance duties pending the results of the audit." Carol said, "You cannot do that." Dale said, "Yes, I can." Carol said, "I have a committee." Dale said, "You have a title, not immunity." Linda said, "I am calling for a motion to authorize the audit." Tom said, "So moved." Another board member, a woman named Sarah, said, "Second." Linda said, "All in favor." Tom and Sarah raised their hands. Linda raised hers. She said, the motion passes, the audit is authorized. Carol slammed her phone case on the table and said, this is unacceptable. Linda said, Carol, you are suspended from compliance duties effective immediately. Carol said, you do not have the authority. Linda said, the board just voted, we have the authority. Carol said, I will appeal this. Dale said, you can file an appeal, but the suspension stands until the audit is complete. Carol's voice cracked. She said, you do not build to my standard, you pay to my standard. Tom said, Carol, sit down. Carol did not sit. She turned to the room and said, if any of you think this is fair, you are wrong. Rachel stood up and said, Carol, you lied to me about a deadline and I paid a fine I did not owe. Another neighbor, a man named Steve, stood up and said, you told me I missed the window when I never even got the notice. Carol said, the portal log is proof. Steve said, the portal log is fake. Carol's face went from purple to white. She said, I do not have to listen to this, and she walked toward the door. Dale stepped in front of her and said, Carol, you need to stay for the rest of the hearing. Carol said, I am leaving. Dale said, if you leave, I will recommend the board file a formal complaint with the state. Carol stopped. She said, on what grounds? Dale said, fraud, misrepresentation of records, and breach of fiduciary duty. Carol stared at him. Then she sat down in the back row and crossed her arms. Linda said, the complaint against the homeowner is dismissed. I said, thank you. Linda said, do you have anything else you would like to add? I said, yes. I am requesting that the board publish standards and timelines to all homeowners so this does not happen again. Tom said, that is a good idea. I will draft a proposal for the next meeting. Linda said, anything else? I said, I am also requesting a refund for any fees I was charged related to this complaint. Linda said, there were no fees charged yet. I said, good. Thank you. Linda said, the hearing is adjourned, and she banged the gavel. The room erupted in noise. People were talking over each other. Some were standing, some were clapping. Paul walked up to me and said, you did it. I said, we did it. Rachel came over and said, thank you, I have been waiting 2 years for someone to call her out. I said, it is not over yet, the audit still has to happen. She said, it will, Dale is not messing around. I looked over at Carol, who was sitting alone in the back row staring at her phone. Her bright phone case was still in her hand, but she was not waving it like a badge anymore. She looked small and beaten. Dale walked over to me and said, good work tonight. I said, thank you for backing me up. He said, I did not do it for you. I did it because it is the right thing. I said, what happens next? He said, I will oversee the audit personally, and I will make sure every case is reviewed. If we find more evidence of fraud, we will recommend criminal charges. I said, will that stick? He said, that is up to the state, but I will make sure they have everything they need. I said, thank you. He said, you are welcome, and he walked out. The next week, I got an email from the management company. It said the internal audit had identified 18 cases with backdated notices and fabricated timelines. 12 of those cases resulted in fines that were being refunded. 6 of those cases involved Carol altering portal logs after the fact. The email also said Carol had been removed from all HOA duties, and the board was considering a formal vote to ban her from holding any leadership position in the future. I forwarded the email to every neighbor who had contacted me, and I got replies from all of them. Rachel said, this is the best news I have had in 2 years. Steve said, I cannot believe it actually worked. Paul called me and said, you started something big, you know that. I said, I just wanted to prove she was lying. He said, "You did more than that. You exposed a system that was broken, and now they have to fix it." I said, "I hope so." He said, "They will. Dale is not going to let them off the hook." I said, "Good," and I hung up. 2 weeks later, the board held a special meeting to vote on new compliance standards. They published a policy requiring all violation notices to be sent by certified mail with tracking. They published a timeline showing homeowners had 30 days to cure any violation and 15 days to appeal any fine. They published a rule requiring the compliance committee to keep detailed logs of all notices, including creation dates and delivery confirmations. They also published a rule stating that any homeowner could request a copy of their compliance file at any time with no processing delay. Carol did not attend the meeting. Linda announced that Carol had resigned from the HOA and would not be returning. The room was silent for a second, then someone in the back started clapping. The applause spread through the room. I sat in the third row next to Paul and I did not clap. I just sat there and felt the weight lift off my shoulders. A month later, I was walking to my mailbox when I saw Carol's house had a for sale sign in the yard. I did not feel good about it, but I did not feel bad either. She made her choices, and she paid for them. Paul walked over and said, "Did you see?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "She is moving to Florida." I said, "Good luck to Florida." He laughed and said, "You know, this whole thing could have been avoided if she had just followed the rules." I said, "She thought she was the rules." He said, "A lot of people think that until someone proves them wrong." I said, "I guess so." He said, "You did a good thing." I said, "I just did not want to get screwed." He said, "You did more than that. You changed the whole system." I said, "I hope it sticks." He said, "It will. People are paying attention now." I said, "Good." And I walked back to my house. A week later, I got a letter in the mail from the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services. It said they had received a referral from the management company regarding fraudulent record-keeping practices at Pinecrest Village Estates Association. They were opening an investigation, and they wanted to interview me as a witness. I called Dale and told him. He said, "That is good news. It means they are taking it seriously." I said, "What happens if they find evidence of fraud?" He said, "Carol could face civil penalties, and if it is bad enough, criminal charges." I said, "Do you think it will go that far?" He said, "I do not know, but I gave them everything I have, so if it is there, they will find it." I said, "Thanks for doing that." He said, "It is my job," and I hung up. I never found out if Carol faced charges. The investigation took months, and by the time it concluded, I had moved on. The HOA published quarterly compliance reports showing every notice issued, every fine assessed, and every appeal filed. The reports were clean. No more backdated notices. No more fabricated timelines. No more moving goalposts. The system was not perfect, but it was better, and that was enough. Paul and I still talk every few weeks. He says the neighborhood feels different now, lighter somehow. People trust the process again. They know they can fight back if something is wrong, and they know the board will listen. He says that is because of what I did, but I do not think it is just me. I think it is because people were tired of being treated like suspects, and they were ready to demand better. I just gave them the proof they needed to make it happen. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.